Okay, hi. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Cheryl Jamison. I'm a VMware Senior Pre-Sales Systems Engineer here at Tech Data, and I have with me Cameron Four, who is also a Senior Systems Engineer, but he's directly with VMware. And today we're going to talk a little bit about VMware Mirage, new product from VMware, formerly I believe it was called Winova, might be, but it basically it can help you with things like zero-touch disaster recovery, hardware refresh, and Windows 7 migrations, and a whole bunch of other things that Cameron's going to talk about today. Before we get started, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and I will get to them as quickly as I can. And I'm also recording this session, so I'll be sure to get the recording out to you. Usually it takes about 24 hours for them to get the recording to me, and then I'll get it out to you as soon as possible. But Cameron Four, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Cheryl, and thank you for the introduction. As Cheryl mentioned, we are going to be going over the VMware Mirage solution today. This is a part of our Winova acquisition that we made earlier last year, or this year, actually. So for just a very high-level agenda, what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick product overview. We're going to talk about what the Mirage solution is and what it means really in terms of, you know, how does it really compare and contrast itself from a VDI solution such as VMware View? What does it mean to the IT department? What does it mean to the end users themselves? And we'll give a couple of good customer target use cases or examples. Then we'll actually look at the overall architecture of the environment, what kind of server components you're going to require, hardware requirements.
To unmute your line, press *6 or #6.
And then we'll actually look at a quick overview of what's involved with the deployment. And then finally, we will wrap it up with just a quick slide on packaging and pricing, just so you can kind of see how we're positioning the product. And then we'll actually open it up for a Q&A session at the very end. So until that time, make sure you get all of your questions into the chat window, and Cheryl will try to answer those questions throughout the presentation. If we don't answer them during the presentation, we will try to get them by the end of the session. Okay? Okay, so what does the Mirage solution do in terms of the IT department? What are their main goals, and what is it really looking to help solve from a customer problem perspective? At the very top of the list, you know, the very thing that I think that really stands out for a lot of customers is single image management. And this is probably one of the big areas that a lot of customers struggle with. You know, if you think a lot of typical environments where, you know, even if a customer standardizes on a single OEM platform such as HP or Dell, even within those platforms, you know, as various models kind of change from one another, there are a lot of different drivers that go along with different systems. And because of that, you know, most IT departments have to deal with IT image or desktop image sprawl. Okay, so they're managing lots of desktop images. And this is actually one of the solutions that VMware View promised to solve, and it really has, because VMware View itself gives us the capability to take a single virtual machine or a single virtual machine template and really replicate that image out to as many endpoints as we need to as quickly as possible. Well, this is also something that VMware Mirage does itself. However, Mirage is not a virtualization solution. What we like to say about Mirage is it's all about managing centrally but executing locally. So really all of the management is done within house. It's done from a single admin screen, but all of the endpoints themselves are actually running their own desktop image. But how we manage that solution is really what makes Mirage very slick from an overall ease of deployment and overall simplification of a customer's environment. The other aspect that it brings to the table is disaster recovery of an entire PC. If we think about what VMware View can do is, you know, with a single click of a button, we can either recompose or refresh and just re-provision an end user a brand new desktop within a few minutes. Well, because Mirage is not a virtualization solution, it doesn't really work that way, but what it can do is actually take that image that's been backed up from the various endpoints and restore that to any new hardware device that the user brings to the table. So let's, for example, say that, you know, you're using your laptop today, maybe it's lost or stolen, or maybe it becomes corrupt. and you go out to Best Buy and get you a new laptop, but you need to get up and running quickly as possible. Well, the Mirage solution will allow the IT admin centrally to click a button and say, restore this user's endpoint device, and it will push all those changed endpoints down, or all the bits that are needed to restore that laptop as quickly as possible. If your device already has Windows 7 on it and the IT standardized image is Windows 7, not only is it going to push down the IT version of the base image, but it's only going to push down the bits that are needed. So one of the things that we will see about the Mirage solution is that it is very efficient from a network transfer perspective and what bits is actually sending across the wire to that endpoint device. So we're not having to send duplicate data that already exists on that target device. And we'll see some more examples of that later on. Another area that Mirage helps with is zero-touch repair and break fix. Right? So again, if an end user calls and says they're having trouble with their endpoint device, maybe their laptop is corrupt or they got a virus or something like that, again, with a single point and click, the admin can quickly fix that endpoint device by just repairing the bits that need to be repaired and not having to re-image that entire device. So it's very powerful from that perspective. Another key component of Mirage are migrations. A lot of customers today, they're still stuck on Windows XP. Some of this because they have application requirements that kind of force them to continue to use XP, or maybe it's just because the actual business itself hasn't taken the time to do the upgrade path because it's very challenging. And if you think about the challenges that it really takes to migrate someone from even just one machine to another, such as copying all of their data, copying all of their user personalization, it really makes the process very time-consuming for IT, and so a lot of IT departments simply haven't done it. What Mirage can do, however, is actually take a corporate standard image, let's say it's Windows 7, and if they're still running Windows XP today, we can actually transition that endpoint device to Windows 7 seamlessly without losing any of the applications or data that were on that endpoint device. And so it makes it very powerful from that perspective. Now, one thing I will say is even though we can transition them from XP to Windows 7, what we can't do is guarantee application compatibility. If you have a Windows XP application that will not work on Windows 7, Mirage does not fix that, does not help it work on Windows 7. It will transfer the data, but it's not going to guarantee application compatibility. This is one of those areas where you'll want to use or leverage some of the tools such as VMware ThinApp. So ThinApp is all about application virtualization and guaranteeing compatibility between older operating systems and newer operating systems. And this is actually one of those areas that the two solutions work really well together. Okay. Another example of this is we can actually do hardware migrations. So maybe you don't need to transition from XP to Windows 7. Maybe you have an old set of devices and the company is looking at upgrading to all new devices, and they need a way to seamlessly transition all of their users to their new devices. Mirage is one of those solutions that will allow them to do that. Another interesting area where the Mirage and VMware View work well together is, let's say that from a DR perspective, your laptop is gone or you've lost it, but you still need to get up and running really quickly and be able to do your work. Well, if the customer already has VMware View, they can actually transition their backed up image in Mirage and push it to a virtual desktop. They can then connect to that virtual desktop and continue to work just as they would before. And then when their new endpoint device arrives, they can then take that virtual desktop image that they're currently working on in VMware View and push that to their new endpoint device so that they have a minimum amount of downtime possible. Now, from an end user's perspective, what do they get out of it? Well, the first thing they get is native performance. Why? Because, as we said before, it's all about managing centrally but executing locally. So it's still Windows running on a desktop. But how we do it is very unique with inside of VMware Mirage, and we'll show you that a little bit later. But it gives us an extra capability. It's not just a simple backup tool. Another thing that it gives us is persistent personalization. Again, because everything's being stored locally, all of our data is being kept locally. We don't lose any data persistence or anything like that. We also have the ability to do work online or offline. One thing I will point out is because we're not virtualizing anything, we are not required to have any type of internet connection back to the main data center. Okay, so there's no bandwidth, there's no protocol to necessarily worry about except from a backup perspective. So there is bandwidth being consumed when we're backing up back to the corporate data center, but we don't require it for a protocol. So we don't need PC over IP, we don't need RDP to make a connection to our endpoint device. There's also a snapshot restore feature built into the product. Because we are backing up here periodically, I believe it's by default set to 1 hour, which is, of course, is customizable. An end user can actually restore to an earlier point in time if they know that that's a known good state of their particular endpoint device. There's also a fast restore over WIN feature, which we'll go into a little bit more detail later, but it's simply just to allow the end users to get up and running as quickly as possible in the case that they've corrupted their laptop or endpoint device. There's also a self-service and directory file recovery mechanism. This is really for, if users accidentally deleted a file or they need to go back to a previous version of the file, or maybe they deleted an entire directory, this feature will allow them to go in and actually recover those files without having to engage an admin. There's also a web-based file access portal. So if the end users themselves don't have access to their current endpoint device, but they still need access to their files, they can log into this web-based portal, get access to them, either save them locally or edit them on the web-based portal themselves, and just kind of continue to work as possible until they get access to their device again. All right, so let's look at some example target use cases. And we've kind of covered these briefly in the previous conversation, but we'll kind of re-highlight them. Again, some target areas are customers looking to do Windows 7 migrations. Again, this is a big aspect and component of the product, and you will actually see that there's an entire SKU or packaging of this product dedicated to just allowing migration only. VDI prospect customers, so customers who are either existing VDI customers or customers who are considering VDI. Because this is not an all-or-nothing solution, VMware Mirage will work really well with customers who are deploying VDI in the process of deploying VDI, or maybe VDI did not work out for them. Maybe they didn't like being virtualized. Maybe they didn't like having remote connectivity. VMware Mirage is the alternative to those types of solutions. But in the examples that we gave before, of course, the two solutions can also work really well together. And DR break fix. That's a big component of this solution. A lot of customers struggle to really wrap a DR plan around the endpoints in their environment, particularly if they're remote users. Or the company has remote branch offices, and most of them use laptops, for example. A lot of them just don't even bother trying to back up the data because it's too challenging. And so Mirage is definitely that solution to allow them and to help them to do that. Okay, so let's look at some of the architecture and requirements. From a components or server components perspective, when we look at doing the Mirage installation, there are really just three main components we have to worry about. So the first one is the Mirage management server. And this server is basically just responsible for interacting with the database itself and really storing information about the environment. The major component, the component that's really doing all the work, is the Mirage server itself. This is where all the data is being backed up to. This is where all of the work is actually provisioned from. So if there is a new base image to push out to all of the endpoints in the environment, the Mirage server itself is pushing out those objects. From a management perspective, the Mirage Management Console, this is really just the main user interface that the admins have to connect to. And it really is the only interface they have to worry about for managing the environment. The file portal mechanism that we talked about is an optional feature. It doesn't have to be installed. But of course, most customers, if they pay for it, of course, they're going to want to install it. Really, the only requirement here is that it needs to be on a server that is on the same domain. The other thing is, it can also be installed on the Mirage server itself. The only real requirement there is that, try not to put it on there if it's going to be too much load on the main Mirage server. So this is really more of an architectural decision that you'll have to make with your customers. You have to kind of determine, how much work is the Mirage server going to be doing, and does it really have enough resources to also manage that additional file portal as well. The aspect, or the only part that you have to worry about deploying to the clients is the Mirage client itself. Okay, so one thing we will say here, it is a pretty small file. It's only 2 megs in size, but it is a MSI file. So that basically means this is a Windows-only solution. Okay, we do not support Macintosh devices in this environment. So we are really focused on XP and Windows 7 compatible hardware. And from a compatibility standpoint, that really is the compatibility that we require, is that the end users must have a device that's compatible with Windows XP or Windows 7. And that should pretty much fit every device out there. I'm not saying that there's not older devices out there, but for the most part, that should cover everyone. The other component that we will talk about today in a little bit more detail later is the branch reflector. And this is a very important component, particularly when you're dealing with customers who have remote offices. And what this feature does is it's basically just an efficient way for us to copy the changes to a remote or branch office. And basically what it's doing is we can actually designate one of the endpoints at that branch as a branch reflector, and then simply tell it to download the bits and push all those changes out to all of its remote peers. So it's more of a download it once to the branch versus download it for every single object that exists at that branch. Okay, and we actually have another slide on that again, just to kind of reiterate those points and how that works. As far as the branch reflector installation goes, there is no additional software. It's actually a component of the Mirage client itself. Really, all an admin needs to do is to go into the admin user interface and designate one of the endpoints as a reflector. Okay, so let's look a little bit under the covers at what Mirage is actually doing from the image perspective. Now, there are some other similar technologies out there on the market, but essentially what this is doing is Mirage is actually taking the image that's being deployed to the various endpoints and breaking it up into individual layers. And this is done for a very important reason. You know, once we start to break apart the subcomponents of the image into individual layers, we can actually back up the layers individually and actually restore them individually. When we look at some of these layers, we have the driver library, we have the base layer, which is the operating system, any core applications that IT wants to provision. We also have the machine identity layer, the user application layer, which means that users can actually install their own applications and drivers and continue to work, even if it's not included in the base layer from IT. And of course, all of the user personalization layer, that's where their data and their profile information is stored. Now, the layers in red is really the layers that IT controls. Okay, and these are really important because what this means is, you know, if I have a base layer that's just the operating system, then if I want to upgrade someone from XP to Windows 7, then all I really need to push them are the Windows 7 bits. We don't need to take away their ability to have, you know, their own user personalization, their own applications. All of those layers can continue to exist without us interacting with them, and so we don't. Now, if there's any applications that IT wants to include as part of that image, they can certainly do so, and it's also included in the base layer. And we can also have a separate driver library, because keep in mind the driver library is really the most unique aspect of the individual machines throughout the environment. So this is really a good thing to have separately because, you know, each new machine is going to have its own driver library requirements, and so being able to separate it out is very important. Of course, the other thing I will keep in mind is there's also a user application layer where a user can install their own drivers. So if they add additional equipment or they want to use different drivers than what IT has provided them, they can absolutely do that. Okay, so again, as we said, Mirage solution is all about managing centrally, executing locally. And this is just a quick overview of the solution and how it's deployed. So when we look at the Mirage server, again, this is where all of the actions are really coming from. All of the data are being stored in the data center on the Mirage server, and all the changes are being pushed out from here. Again, we're going to reiterate that this is not a VDI solution, so there's no load we have to worry about running on the Mirage server from a VDI perspective. We're not running virtual machines. All the images that we're pushing out from the main data center are all coming from this Mirage server. Now, the first thing that we need to do is actually deploy the Mirage client to the endpoint devices. Now, once we deploy that client, the client itself is then going to take the image that is already on the existing device and break it into those logical layers that we saw on the previous screen. Now, once we've broken it into those layers are then going to be backed up as centralized images in the main data center. So we've just made a decision that we're going to carve up the images they already have and then back them up. The next thing that we can do from an IT perspective is actually create our own base layer. So if we want to give a golden image standard that has all the security properties that we want, It's the exact same version of Windows that we want. We as the IT admins can then make that decision and have it deployed out to the centralized images in the data center. So that is the next step. The next step is to say, okay, now we're going to apply our customized base layer to the images in the data center. Now, once that has occurred, the very next step is the endpoint devices see that there are now changed bits that need to be downloaded. Okay, so they're actually going to make a decision, okay, here are the bits that I have locally, and I see that there are new bits that are different from mine in the data center. And it's only going to download the bits that it needs and what's different than what is currently existing on their local device. So when we look at network optimization capabilities, VMware Mirage is very efficient from a transfer perspective. We only store data once. When we push that original copy of the data from the endpoint users back to the data center, if these two laptops, for example, both had Windows 7 and they were both exactly identical, only one of them would have had to actually push their data across the wire, because in the main data center, we already have a copy of the data. So there's no need for the other guy to already push the bits that are already existing, because the other guy has already pushed it, if that makes sense. So it's more of a only push or only transfer bits over if they're unique. And it's not just unique to itself, but it's also unique to every other device in the environment. So if I already have a copy of Windows 7 in my main data center, then none of those endpoint devices are going to push back a copy because it's already there. So that's very important to understand. Another key aspect is, all of our network transfers are also compressed. So again, we're only sending bits once, but we're also compressing the traffic that's going across the wire, so we get as much efficient possible transfer as we can. Another key thing to keep in mind is, because everything is executing locally, we do not require this LAN connection, and we do not require this Mirage server. So if the Mirage server were to go down, the endpoints are still running a local copy of Windows. There's no hypervisor. There's nothing to log into from a network perspective. They are running Windows locally, so they can continue to operate even when they don't have access to the local data center. From a hardware requirements perspective, when we're looking at the Mirage server, again, because this is not a VDI solution, we really don't require a lot of resources from a CPU and memory perspective. For managing up to 100 endpoints, it really only requires a single dual-core processor with 8 gigs of RAM. And the maximum number of users on a single server we support is up to 1,500, and that's with a dual quad-core processor and 16 gigs of RAM. Now, where we really come into a resource-intensive perspective is the storage, because we are actually backing up all of the data that the end users are creating themselves. Now, we go to a lot of efforts to make sure that we do heavy deduping. So again, we're only storing data once, but there's still a lot of information that the end users create themselves as far as change data. So when we look at the amount of space that an average user is going to consume, what we really choose to plan for is around 15 gigabytes per user. But that's going to vary per customer. Some are going to use less than 15 gigs. Some are going to consume more 15 gigs. Now, that 15 gigs is not talking about, the operating system space. That's talking about just user files that they create themselves. From a storage support perspective, we support using SAN, NAS, or local storage. But it really depends on how you're deploying this solution and what's really going to be your best practice recommendation around the storage. So a lot of planning really needs to go into storage from a capacity perspective, just an overall architecture perspective. We have a note here that says Lenovo recommends enabling compression on the Mirage storage volume so that you can get additional savings in storage. So again, we're deduping the data, but they can also get additional savings by compressing that storage as well. From the client perspective, I've kind of already mentioned this, but really the requirement again is that they need a XP compatible hardware or better from an HCL perspective. So that's really the only requirement. And the endpoint device is going to need at least 5 gigabytes of free space for us to write the changes into. So if we're pushing out new changes that need to be implemented into their local device, they're going to need some temporary storage to store those changes. Now, as I mentioned before, this really is a Windows-based solution. So even from a server software perspective, everything is Windows. So when we look at the Mirage server, install Windows Server 2008 R2 64-bit edition. It is going to require that the admin install the .NET 3.5 Service Pack 1 software. And from a database perspective, it's SQL Server 2008 R2 or R2 Express. Now, Express is not really recommended for normal deployments. It's really just recommended for demo environments, but both versions are supported. And as far as the file portal mechanism goes, again, still Windows, so it is going to require IIS version 7.0 or greater, and all of the ASP.NET components will also need to be installed separately as well. And again, the Mirage client, again, XP 32-bit or Windows 7 32 or 64-bit. Now, from a network utilization perspective, typically what we tell customers to plan for is roughly about 50 megabytes of change per day per user. So that basically breaks down to roughly 15 kilobits per second per user. So these are really just planning numbers to use. You know, your mileage will vary, of course, depending on the customer's environment, but these are good average numbers that we've been given from Lenovo. Quality of service can also be implemented on any of the routers or network switches so that you can kind of guarantee good traffic and good connectivity throughout the environment. And there's also a client-side throttling mechanism so that the bandwidth that the client is using or consuming when it's actually replicating back to the data center, it can be dynamically adjusted depending on what the user is doing so that we can kind of guarantee best user experience as possible. And, of course, if the customer knows that they're going to be in a situation where they have limited connectivity and they need to make sure that their network is not affected at all, they can actually snooze any Mirage network operations to make sure that they don't interfere with what they are doing. Okay, so let's look at an average deployment. You know, this looks like some of our very similar VDI or VMware View type deployments. The key component that I really want to focus on here is the main data center aspects, where we actually are showing you a Mirage server cluster. So from an availability perspective, or even from a growth or scalability perspective, we can actually cluster the Mirage servers together to get better scalability if we need to, or even availability, if that's a concern for the customer. However, if they are going to look at using a Mirage server cluster, that is going to require them to have some type of centralized storage. So it can't be locally attached storage if they're going to be using clustering technology. They will need some type of NAS or SAN type of device for that type of storage connectivity. They will also need to implement a load balancer in front of the Mirage server cluster. Now, this could be some type of hardware load balancer that they already have in their environment, or it could be as simple as a Microsoft load balancer or some type of Linux free load balancer that they have available to them. We even support the load balancing capabilities coming out of our networking and security suite, such as our vShield Edge appliance. That also supports doing load balancing capabilities. If the customer wants to look at doing that, they absolutely can. Now, the component that we talked about before is the branch reflector, and I wanted to go over one more time just exactly how that branch reflector works. So when we talked about having IT push out that new base image, let's say that they need to do that to a single branch. You know, IT has made a decision, we're going to standardize on Windows, but we're going to include the latest, greatest service pack. The first thing that's going to happen is the Mirage branch reflector is going to detect that there are new bits that they need to download from the Mirage server back at the main data center. It's then going to scan all of the clients at the local branch that they're sitting at to determine who needs what bits. And then this one branch reflector is going to download all of those bits from the main data center and compile an image that needs to be distributed to all of the endpoint clients. And that really is the third step, which is actually distribute it locally to all its peers. And, of course, if there's someone that's not online or maybe one of these aren't available, it will kind of continue to push out those changes as those clients become available. On this particular example, when we just look at it from a network savings perspective, you know, if this is a 50-user branch and we're pushing out a 10-gigabyte image, you know, instead of having to push out 500 gigabytes of change data across the wire, we only have to push that 10 gigabytes once. And so, again, it just makes the whole environment much more efficient from a transfer perspective. Now, as I mentioned before, we also have the capability to do server clustering. And again, the maximum number of users per server recommended is 1,500 per server, but we can also scale up to supporting 20,000 users per Mirage cluster. Now, the nice thing is that these nodes can actually be dynamically added as the customer needs to, and so there's no actual downtime that's incurred. But again, going back to our previous conversation, even if they wanted to take this server cluster offline, no one would actually be affected. The only things that are affected is that no one can actually receive new updates, and the data that's being changed from the endpoints can't be backed up. So that's really the only thing that's really being affected. They also have the ability to grow their storage as they go. So maybe the customer doesn't know exactly how much storage they're going to need up front, or maybe they can't afford all the storage that they need up front. They can buy what they need to run the environment right now, and then a year or two down the line, they can buy additional storage as they need to. Now, from an app delivery perspective, really the only app delivery mechanism we have is to deliver those applications into the base layer itself. So if a customer wants better granularity for delivering applications, that's where they're really going to have to look at products such as VMware ThinApp and also Horizon as well, because they can actually give them much better granular control of delivering individual applications to those users. And it's also going to give them that application virtualization. So if they need to guarantee compatibility between two different types of operating systems, they can do that with ThinApp if they need to. But they can also continue to use any traditional app delivery tools. So if the customer already has app delivery tools in their environment, they can absolutely continue to use those even if they move to a Mirage solution. Okay, and just to review the network and storage optimizations, the one feature that we mentioned before, which we're calling the desktop streaming over WAN, this is really a progressive restore type mechanism. So if a customer or endpoint user calls in and says, hey, my laptop is down, I need to get back up and running as quickly as possible, this one particular feature allows a progressive restore of that endpoint device. The first thing it's going to do is actually download all of the bits that it needs to get it back up and running first, and then it's going to intelligently stream the rest of the data on demand. And it will actually prioritize that data as that data is being accessed. So if there's a particular file that an end user is trying to open up, and if it's not on that local device, it will actually prioritize that file ahead of the rest of the other files that need to be copied. And so it's pretty efficient from that particular perspective. From a global data reduction, again, we're doing heavy deduping on the data store on the Mirage server. So where everything's being backed up to, we're doing deduping there. But also, what I can also recommend is that, if customers are leveraging some type of SAN solution, a lot of those vendors have their own dedupe technologies so they can get additional savings from a space perspective. But you really need to make sure you work with a storage architect to really understand how much expectation they can have from a storage savings perspective. From a network optimization, again, one thing I will review is that we only send data once, whether it's sending it from the data center to the endpoint device or from the endpoint device back to the data center. If either one of the two already has the data, we don't send it. And when we do send it, we actually compress that data. So again, everything is streamlined as possible. From a data integrity and security perspective, we do highly recommend that customers implement SSL because it is part of the solution. However, it is an option, of course. If the customer is looking at doing a remote deployment, or they're going to have users connecting remotely outside of the corporate data center, they absolutely need to implement SSL because otherwise their data transfers will not be encrypted. If they are doing it internally, of course, it's less of a choice, but again, best practice, use SSL. From a storage perspective, where we're actually storing the data on the Mirage server, we're really just using NTFS layer controls there. So all the ACLs that apply to Windows still occur and apply to the Windows data store on the Mirage server. Alternatively, that we say here, if they're implementing some type of NAS storage such as NetApp or EMC, they usually have their own data security tools that a customer can also leverage to protect their data in the Mirage solution. From an integrity perspective, we do MD5 checksums everywhere just so we can guarantee that either the backup or the restore of the data is good. We also support the Windows encryption file service as well. So if the customer wants to leverage the Windows encryption file system, they can turn that feature on, and it is supported with the Mirage solution. But we also support third-party file encryption technologies as well, such as BitLocker or Sophos Safeguard. And of course, we actually have the ability to work with their APIs so that we can actually decrypt and encrypt files on the fly as they're being backed up and restored to and from the data center. Again, just a quick review of the overall key things to really listen for from an overall solution sales trigger perspective. Again, Win 7 migrations, hardware refreshes, these are key areas for the Mirage solution. Centralized image management. Again, this is one area where a lot of customers struggle today, particularly if they're a good-sized company. Branch office and retail stores. Mirage has a great solution, particularly if you're working with any banks. I've worked with some banks in the past trying to get them to implement VDI solutions. But a lot of them were just hesitant because they were worried, if we lost our internet connection, we wouldn't have the ability to work with our customers. And because of that, they were very hesitant. Implementing a solution like VMware Mirage, even with the VDI solution, will allow them to really get beyond those barriers and just preventing them to moving into more of a centralized managed desktop environment. And of course, finally, disaster recovery and repair. That's all built into the Mirage solution and really allows customers to do something that a lot of them are not doing today, particularly around their endpoint devices, their desktops and laptops. From a packaging and pricing perspective, this is as current as far as September. If there's any changes, I haven't seen any just yet. So the good thing is there's really only two ways you can buy the product. There's the full product, which includes everything that we talked about today. So that includes single image management, OS migrations, image repair, bare metal restores of an entire laptop, full system rewind. That's the snapshot feature capabilities of the product. That's around $200 per user. Now, if the customer is just looking at using the tool or Mirage for doing migrations, maybe it's for a hardware migration from one laptop to a newer laptop, then they can certainly use that particular product suite. Now, my understanding is that's per migration, so it's not per user or per device. So once they've done the migration, they would then have to buy the license again to do an additional migration. Okay. Well, that pretty much wraps it up for what I wanted to cover with everyone today. So I'll turn it back over to Cheryl, but now we'll just open it up for any additional Q&A questions that you guys might have around the solution.
Thank you, Cameron. I did have one question I do want to share with everyone. It was regarding what databases are supported to communicate with the management server. Basically, it looks like, according to the database prerequisites of the Administrator's Guide, is Microsoft SQL Server 2008 64-bit R2. However, it does support all the additions of that, which is the Express, SQL Express, Standard, and Enterprise. So those are the choices. Anything you want to add to that, Cameron?
No, I mean, that's absolutely correct. I mean, for now, it is truly a Windows-only type solution. I do not know and haven't seen any roadmaps that they're planning on supporting any additional databases in the future.
Okay, great.
But I'm sure that will change if there's additional customer demand demanding some type of other database support.
Right. Let me see. Any more questions? Wow, this is a quick one today. All right. Looks like no other questions. I did put my email in the chat box there. I'll send you out the recorded session, everyone, so you can go back over it. And you will also have my contact information in case you have any questions that come up and any questions that I can answer. Anyway, oh, Lisa, did you have another question? All right, hang on a second. Let me, I think Lisa might have one more question here. Let me unmute you. 1 second. Let's see. Okay, Lisa, you're unmuted. Did you have a question?
I did. I have a customer that the VMware sales team has told them that they think a viable option is Mirage because of limited bandwidth for the remote locations. The problem I'm up against is that, what the customer wants to do right now is put a server in each one of these remote locations and install VMware View, and then I got to worry about how to back it up with the bandwidth and so forth. Some of his locations have less than 128K DSL. So, you know, everything that you're talking about here talks about having the Mirage server and so forth in the main data center and all of the, you know, updates being pushed out. I understand, you know, the first time we're pushing out the complete image, and then after that, it's only the changes, and if there are any changes to the applications and so forth. Great concept. I love it, but I'm just wondering if this is a good use case scenario. The one thing you did say was that even if they do lose their connection, they can still work and run locally. So I'm thinking this is a much better option than the customer putting a server in each one of these locations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I would say to that is, you know, when you're looking at the architecture of someone that has limited connectivity, such as a DSL connection, you know, really the only bandwidth we're consuming is what we're backing up, and any bandwidth that's needed to push out a new image. So a lot of the times what a customer can do, you know, if they push out the changes to like a branch reflector, maybe they need to, and this is just an extreme case, maybe they would actually have to do one locally, just because, again, if they were, I wouldn't necessarily recommend them doing a full upgrade from XP to Windows 7. That would be really difficult to manage. You know, 10 gigabits across, or 10 gigabytes of data across a 128K DSL connection would take forever, right? Even if it's just doing it once, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
In that case, they would almost have to do it locally and then take that branch reflector out to the branch office and have it replicate all the changes out. But still a good way,
okay.
much better solution than what VDI could offer them. Because VDI is going to, you know, is going to require constant bandwidth, constant protocol. The only thing that we're really requiring is that there's some type of pipe to be able to back up the end user devices if they need to. And it's going to be much more of a simplified solution than what VDI is going to bring them.
Okay. I guess I need to dig a little deeper into this then before I work with this customer the way they want to go.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that Cheryl and I can help you with. You know, if we need to get on the phone with the customer and really hammer out the details of what's going to work, what's not going to work, you know, these are things that Cheryl's great with helping people out with.
Okay, yep, great. All right, thank you, Lisa. Anyone else? All right, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Cameron. And I'll go ahead and send the information out. You'll all get it tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.